Yeah, well, perception is the fundamental issue in Blake. As a man is, so he sees. And awake is a very Blakean word. God cries to Albion, awake, Albion, um, many times. And so that verb, which is common in Enlightenment spiritual traditions as opposed to Enlightenment rational traditions, um, it is a very natural one for Blake. And I wanted a sense in the title of my book that I'm talking about a Blake who can make a difference now.
Mark Vernon, welcome to Beyond Meaning. I'm excited and grateful to have you on the show. You're one of the most unique and profound voices today talking about psychology, philosophy, and the inner life in general. And you also have a new book, which you have over there on the bookshelf behind you, Awake, William Blake and the Power of the Imagination. And it's a fascinating book, just as much about William Blake's life and work as it is, I find, a manifesto on the imagination as a different mode of experiencing reality and a spiritual human faculty, perhaps the most spiritual human faculty. And I'm excited to discuss all these things with you. But before we dive into it, could you say a few words of introduction concerning William Blake and perhaps highlight what makes him so important for our modern time and our crisis of meaning today?
Yeah, well, thanks, Simeon. It's very good to speak about these things. I think they very much matter. I think one way into this is to read Blake as offering a spiritual analysis for the troubles of our times. And many of those troubles, I think, maybe all of them really, spring from a kind of disconnection from the source of our lives, however that is conceived spiritually. And Blake saw this coming undone. He saw, in a way, the power of modern science, which was really only bedding down in the way that we think of it in his lifetime. So, in the Georgian period, a couple of hundred years ago, there had been early modern science as it's called, but it was still very sort of religiously inspired. People like Francis Bacon thought that they were being given the means to restore Eden on earth. And so there was still a palpable sense of science connecting to divine activity. So it wasn't a closed system unto itself trying to account for reality within the confines of its own domain, becoming uncoupled, therefore, from the wider source. So Blake, though, sees this coming. This is partly what he means by phrases like dark satanic mills. One of his best known phrases. This isn't just a colourful description of factories in England, but it's quite a precise ontological comment, in fact, that understanding the cosmos, as he puts it, as many wheels turning like a gigantic mill in the sky, if you like, leads to an imagination that feels that society can be powered by mills on earth, churning around to produce things that so inspired the Industrial Revolution. And it's satanic, not as a vague allusion to somehow it being evil, but this is quite a precise comment in Blake. It's about an opaque, contracted, limited, and narrowed vision, which is what happened to Satan. Satan was one of the angels of light, closest to God, but fell and lost contact with that connection. And so Blake sees this narrowing, this contraction, this uncoupling, this sort of taking into the human domain all powers of creativity. He sees that happening in his time. and he relates to figures like Isaac Newton and John Locke and Francis Bacon as well to understand this, and therefore offers at the beginning of a trajectory that has now, very substantially manifested itself in our times, 200 years later. He offers this spiritual analysis of what's going wrong at the heart of things. And that has all sorts of then ripple effects from the way we understand ourselves as being human, the way we understand the natural world, the way, of course, we lose sight of the gods and God, of how we understand morality, how we understand education, government, what the nature of politics is. All these elements spin from what Blake saw in his time. And so reading him becomes not just a way of understanding the depth of what's happening in our times, but because he presents it in the form of imagery and poetry, it keeps alive the energy we need to reconnect with what otherwise gets lost. And I think that's why his analysis is also a kind of antidote, and why when you read him, you feel he's immediately onto something. Even a phrase like Doc Satanic Mills, it feels so resonant. And that resonance is at once a re-establishing of the contact with the spiritual energies that have otherwise been pushed to one side or even denied now substantially in the modern period, in the West at least. I think it's different in other parts of the world, and even now that we live in this world where it's very easy to access other spiritual traditions as well, there's a sense of revivification. But Blake can help with that as well. He was actually one of the first readers, for example, of the Bhagavad Gita coming in from India. He knew indigenous Americans as well because of the empire spreading across the Atlantic too. So there's a lot more constructive things to say, but I think that's the heart of it with Blake and what he can teach us today.
You've already said something fascinating concerning the imagination. It's a point you also make early on in the book, which completely gripped me. And that is that science, in a sense, is not the way science presents itself usually is a lucid, objective account of reality, which is very much not imagination. But the way you describe science, and perhaps this is also the way that William Blake portrays it, is a narrow kind of imagination that eliminates other possibilities of imagining reality. And there's many directions we can take this, because we can also talk about language in general, which is an attempt to make sense of reality, and science is the different sciences are a form of language. But to go back to the imagination and how science relates to it, could you talk a little bit more about how science relates to the imagination, and perhaps what are the ways in which we're misguided in perceiving science as other than imagination?
Yes, I mean, one way of telling this is to tell the story, and to remember the massive presence of Isaac Newton on the imagination of the Georgian period as it showed up in the Enlightenment. So, as particularly there was this stress on law and regularity and order and reason, therefore, and method as a way of discovering the truth of things. And Newton had made this astonishing imaginative connection between things falling on Earth, famously the apple falling from a tree, and things moving in the heavens, in particular, say, the moon orbiting the Earth. And we now take that for granted. But if you just look at it for a moment with fresh eyes, it is astonishing that the same description can be applied to both phenomena and, of course, a whole other set of phenomena as well. And this is the law of
Yeah.
gravity in Newton's work. And quite what this force is, Newton actually remains ambivalent. But nonetheless, he makes that force tractable to mathematics. And so that lends a practical power to humanity because it enables further development of technology, which of course takes off. And also, though, leads to the hope that other parts of life will become similarly tractable to reason, whether it's mathematical or logical in another way. And so figures like John Locke, who was a direct protagonist for William Blake as well, he very often references Locke. He wanted to apply this way of investigating things through law to, say, the mind, to, say, government, to, say, education. And then figures like Jeremy Bentham applied it to morality. So utilitarianism is born as well, that tries to show how what's good can be calculated. Bentham explicitly had philosophic calculus. And this notion of the objective, as you mentioned, takes hold. It actually changes its meaning in time. And the objective had just meant previously the surface appearance. And if you'd asked someone in the earlier modern period, maybe, or certainly in the medieval period, the truth of something, they would have said, no, we need the essence, the inner subjective qualities which are unchanging, the soulful, you might say, the most divine. That's what stays fixed. The good, the beautiful, and the true, for example. We can disagree about what those things are in appearance, but that the beautiful matters, that the good matters, that truthful matters, um, isn't doubted. And even when it's rejected, it's kind of given, it's paid homage even in the rejection. Um, but what happened in Blake's time was that the objective, which had been the merely surface appearance, becomes the standard for truth, through a kind of a behaviorism of apples falling from trees on one hand, but a behaviorism of the human creature on the other, a behaviorism of society, and the laws that might describe that behaviorism take hold. And so objectivity becomes the standard of truth. People start talking about objective truth, which just would not have made sense before. Um, and of course, if you think about it, it sort of only half makes sense now, because the fascinating thing about science is that it keeps changing. There's new ideas. And the medieval mind would understand that as a play around the essence of things. And of course, you have many different theories, because they all, as Aristotle put it, save the appearance. They're just ways of describing or teasing out a little bit more of the essence of things. But what happens with figures like Galileo is they said, no, there's one true theory, and that's what we must reach towards. And even if a modern scientist would say, we'll probably never get to a complete formulation of the truth, that the human mind can aspire to do so is very much part of the modern mentality. Of course, this is an imaginative still undertaking, but it's an imagination that has already prescribed itself. So it's not, for example, as Blake would say, contact with the divine imagination, which is running through all things and manifest in all things. It's saying the human mind has imagination, and perhaps the human mind alone has imagination, somehow generated from physically within us. And that, if we're lucky, can be used to project out and to get purchase on the world around us. But it's not a participative form of knowledge, as, say, Plato in the medieval mind would have understood it, meaning that we have to form ourselves in such a way that we can receive the truth of that which is around us. And so virtues and way of life, and understanding yourself, know thyself, as Socrates had insisted, becomes the foundation of all knowledge. No, in the modern world, in principle at least, again, it shouldn't matter who's doing the investigating. You don't ask about the character of your physics teacher when you're doing physics in school. You assume they're teaching you objective facts. And that would have been a very strange way of understanding knowledge before, but becomes the standard now. Things can be sort of written down and stand for all time thereafter. And now I'm old enough, I did a physics degree, and I'm old enough to have seen the whole of physics change, even in my lifetime, say in the last 30 years or so. Things which are now taken as read, in physics just weren't even talked about, like M theory, for example, or when I was doing my physics, the Big Bang was taken as read. Now it's widely questioned. So, even across the course of a generation or so, physics very substantially changes. But we're still in the grip of this narrowed, imaginative assumption that science provides the standard for all knowledge. So that it's still immensely imaginative. And of course, we live in this extraordinarily imagination-driven world. What's the entertainment industry if not a whole economy of the imagination? But throughout is at best an ambivalence, if not an outright denial of this imagination connecting to the divine imagination. Instead, it's treated as if it's pure human creativity, pure human genius. Um, and so, even as the imagination proliferates, it maintains this kind of barrier and so cuts us off still.
Hey there, Simeon here, and this is just a quick break to thank everyone who is supporting my work. These days it's getting harder and harder to make it on YouTube. You have to chase trends, chase sponsors, or edit videos in a dopamine-inducing, algorithm-optimized way, which is none of the things that I try to do. I try to explore the most important, deep, and often difficult questions about life, reality, consciousness, and I try to deliver them in the most meaningful and beautiful way I can manage, which takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and I don't rely on AI to do it for me. If you enjoy this work and if you'd like to see it continue, you can help me out through Patreon, YouTube memberships, or through PayPal. There are benefits to subscribing to my Patreon and YouTube members program, however, as you gain access to our community events, and also you'll be able to submit questions to people I interview on the podcast. Thank you again for spending your time here with me and with this work. And now back to the video. This is very fascinating to me, that when you speak about the imagination, and also when William Blake talks about it, writes about it, it's not concerning some romantic notion or some pretty idea of having nice images and ideas in one's head, but it is a very existential and fundamental quality of human existence, but also of reality as we perceive it, that you're talking about. And also, William Blake, in some part of his poetry, refers to imagination as nature, that nature is nothing but the imagination. And at another part, he refers to imagination as being the eternal body of man and being equivalent to God. And so here I sense that he's talking about, to me at least, it sounds very close to non dual teachings, which many of them we know from the East, such as Advaita Vedanta and some forms of Buddhism, where you get statements such as emptiness is form and form is emptiness. Um, so could we hone in even deeper on the imagination and what William Blake meant by it, and how he sees imagination's role in the cosmos, in reality as we perceive it?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think to sense these parallels, um, maybe just to ask it tangibly. I don't think that Blake knew directly of, say, Advaita Vedanta, but he definitely read the Bhagavad Gita. And I think he also would have got from Christian mysticism what is held within traditions like Advaita Vedanta. So we know, for example, that he definitely read figures like Teresa of Avila. And Teresa of Avila, in the Interior Castle particularly, her later, more mature works, will talk about how we discover inside us, in the heart of the keep of the interior castle within us, the divine presence. And that turns out to be the divine whole, in fact, as well. Um, so, and similarly, there's the readings of the Bhagavad Gita, which uh, were done by people like Shankara and so on. And so I think Blake would have felt at least the presence of the Advaita Vedanta teaching. Um, he might have had a more nuanced version of it. I think he might. I feel if he'd known of it, he might have gone for Kashmiri Shaivism, for example, where there's the sense of the tantric mattering too. So the idea is that in a way, there's the Vedantic moment where you discover the one reality within yourself is the divine reality. But then you don't stop there. That's just the first step to a kind of return to what previously was other and the rest of the world, to see it's now one and the rest of the world. And so you see the divine presence in all things. And so Blake will write, to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity for an hour. Deliberately bringing together the finite and the infinite and seeing that all finite things are reflections or echoes of the infinite, and that the infinite is completely present in all finite things, even as the finite things are as myriad reflections of the one. So I think that's how he would describe it. And then he talks in his poetry, he puts, well, actually, I shouldn't say he puts these words to God. He says actually he receives them. He says, I heard the words of this mild song from the divine Savior, but it's always an active reception for Blake, because he also says I then had to work out how to speak them for myself. So again, that's quite an Advaita sort of teaching, really, that you don't just get downloads. You get inspiration, the Spirit breathes into you, but then that's only complete when you breathe it out again in words. And so Blake will write, I'm not a God afar off, I'm a brother and a friend. I am in you and you're in me, mutual in love divine. Um, so, it becomes quite explicit. He also uses a Christian formula, which was echoed by many of the early church fathers writing on the incarnation, the meeting of God and humanity in Jesus, where Blake says, therefore God becomes as we are, that we may be as he is. So there's that way in which I think non-dualism is expressed within Christianity as well. Um, so yeah, I think that the imagination plays a part here, because the imagination is the dynamic of that realization. It is the spirit, and clearly the word spirit in the Christian tradition is divine. The spirit blowing where it wills. And I've talked about inspiration and expiration. That was seen as the movement of the spirit as well. So that movement of the imagination in our lives, it's the very vitality of all things. That's what the imagination is. And that very vitality becomes the divine body, because it's an expression of the divine life. And nature is imagination itself, because the whole of the created order is an expression of that infinite source. Um, and so I mean that put I don't know quite how it sounds me trying to describe it in that way, but it you sort of know it when you see it. And an example that really works for me is, we're talking now, and in a purely physical description of that, I am making relatively complex vibrations on the air that get picked up by the microphone in my computer, turned into light forms, transmitted down optic fibers and whatever else. Then it appears in your computer, and the machine turns that light back into sound vibrations. But of course, we don't hear sound vibrations, we hear words, and hopefully words with meaning. And so as I use these words, we move together through a kind of shared exploration of these things. And that is the imagination. If the imagination was absent in our every moment, we would just experience the world as the physicist describes it. But of course, we don't experience the world as the physicist describes it. We experience it always as full of meaning and engagement and participation, and whether it be love or hate or understanding or misunderstanding, it's sort of the yearning, but also the realization. That's how we experience life. And so that is what it is to be in the divine body. which is the imagination always already active within us. So the imagination has become this sort of slightly problematic thing in the modern mind because of the sense that, I might have it, you might have it, the artist might have it a bit more. So it's become seen through a kind of scarcity model of reality, when actually the imagination is replete within everybody. The only question is how you collaborate with the imagination or not. But it's an abundance model of the imagination in all things, that we human beings can tune in more or less consciously. The tree, I think, is full of imagination, but doesn't do it with the possibility of deliberate intent in the way that we can. But the artist is someone who's collaborating, with this divine imagination. I mean, the scientist is too. It's just that they are more inclined to understand that collaboration in a narrowed way. Um, yeah, so I hope that gives some sense of what we the imagination's in us quite as naturally as the breath is within us.
You said so many fascinating things. One in particular that caught my attention is when you speak of reality or life as we experience it versus reality or life as described by the physicist or scientist in general, in the sense of, okay, I fall in love and I have this very imaginative experience of what is occurring, and then a biologist comes over and then describes exactly what neurotransmitters and hormones and bodily processes are going in my body, by which my behavior and my experience is explained. And there is such a big temptation or half cognized habit, I think, nowadays, to just assume that the scientific explanation or narrative is the factual narrative and all else is just human imaginings in a sort of not the blatant meaning of the word, but somehow misguided. And reading your book and getting more into Blake was a very important reminder for me that the actual experience of life as we go through it is primary and comes before the scientific narrative that is built by different men and women, again, based on their experiences and based on their collective imaginative project, which is, in this sense, modern science. Um, there is a very there are many beautiful quotes by Blake that I return to now and again. And one of the most important ones to me is where he says that eternity is in love with the productions of time. Um, to me, this has always been meaningful, and yeah, I keep unpacking it uh, uh, deeper and deeper the more time I spend with it. But again, this takes me to a sort of non-dual spirituality or insight into, again, that famous Buddhist verse that form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And recently I did a video on the 10 ox herding pictures of Zen Buddhism. So in these pictures, Zen describes the path of awakening. And it is very interesting that up to the 8th stage of awakening, there is a process of going towards emptiness, towards that peak mystical experience of the, I suppose, undescribable at the heart of reality. But then the final 2 stages, a, re- a return to the everyday, to the to the very uh, I suppose, lived experience of reality as an ordinary human being living an ordinary life. And this kind of life is depicted as really the true achievement of spirituality, uh, a radically ordinary life lived with a full heart and embraced fully, is presented as a higher achievement than losing oneself in the void at the heart of things. So this takes me to a question, which is many modern spiritual teachers and not only modern ones, uh, suggest that spiritual development consists of the practice of emptying the mind of all form, all creatures, everything created, so that we can perceive that ever present, unchanging essence within it all. Blake, on the other hand, perhaps, seems to suggest that no, we dig into the productions of the mind and we, I suppose, follow where they lead us and then find truth within this flow of images, of words, of meanings. What do you think the insight here is, and what is Blake's approach in using the creations of the mind, the imagination, as a guide towards the ungraspable, that which cannot be contained in any image?
I mean, Blake talks a lot about contraries, and contraries can include, for example, the contrary between time and eternity. But the point about contraries is what is generated between them. And so notions of the field also are very important to Blake. And I think that phrases like eternity is in love with the productions of time, they create a sense of that relationship. It's in love. It's not in time we find echoes of eternity. No, it's eternity is in love with the productions of time. And so there's that dynamic giving to time, therefore, which eternity does, but that we might do too. And so become part of that eternal outpouring. And I think it's that dynamism of outpouring, sacrifice. Again, even in the Christian tradition, it would be talked about in terms of dying in order to be born again. Um, I think that's the parallel with discussions of emptiness and form that you see in other traditions. Um, Particularly later in his work, Blake will pray, annihilate the selfhood in me, be thou all my life. And he'll talk about, in his poem Milton, embracing what he calls eternal death in order to understand eternal life. And I don't think we know whether Blake had a kind of meditative practice. There's a sense with him of a much more active kind of contemplative life. He is more in the tantric space than the monk sitting in a cave up a mountain kind of space. But I think that that's only a surface difference. That in a way, the constant failure of the artist to express things in words or in picture is a kind of emptying. But it's an emptying that's manifest in a kind of outpouring rather than a sort of withdrawal. Um, yeah, so I think that Blake he's still part of that tradition, and of course, anyone who's practiced meditation will know that the emptying of the mind is not the most common experience. I think it can happen on occasion, actually, especially if you do longer retreats, say, and you're in a place where that stillness is already present. Um, but certainly in my experience, um, the more common sense is becoming aware of the contents of your mind such that
Yeah.
you can feel the space around the contents of your mind too. And so it's not an emptying of the mind, but it's a perception of the emptiness that's in the mind. Um, and that is where your identity can be found, and so a certain rest can be known. And I think that's very helpful in the modern West, where the likes of you or I pursue these things without living a monastic life. I presume
Yeah.
we've only just said hello, but we're trying to live lives in the world and know of these things, which in previous times would have been the preserve really of individuals living exceptional lives in the sense of withdrawing from the world. Um, we're trying to do a different thing now. And I think Blake can very much help with that.
You've just reminded me of a quote by Blake. I think it is from Jerusalem, if I'm not mistaken, which to me is just very difficult to believe that it doesn't come from a meditation teacher. But here is what Blake writes. He writes, "There is a moment in each day that Satan cannot find, nor can his watch fiends find it. But the industrious find this moment, and it multiply. And when it once is found, it renovates every moment of the day, if rightly placed." Um, could you talk a bit about this quote? What do you think Blake is talking about here?
Yeah, it's a wonderful quote. I mean, it's the epigraph to my book, and um, uh, it comes in this poem Milton, where Blake is describing the reincarnation of Milton in his own person, in the person of Blake, to as it were complete Milton's work. And I think it's Blake understanding his own vocation and tradition connection to other poets, and Milton and Shakespeare, as well as Chaucer, are the kind of three great poets of the English language for Blake, the three great poetic mystics of the English language. And this these few lines come in the middle of quite a turbulent section where Milton is wrestling with eternal death and eternal life, and the heroine of Milton, who's in a way his wife, but also is the feminine divine principle called Olenon. Or I shouldn't say principle really, because principles don't really exist in Blake. If you've got a principle, you've got death. um, but they're vitalities, they're spiritual beings too. Um, Suddenly there's a moment of clarity, and Blake says there's a moment in each day that Satan cannot find, nor can his watch fiends find it. But the industrious find this moment and it multiply. And when it once is found, it renovates every moment of the day, if rightly placed. And I think this is Blake the mystic and Blake the visionary sort of coming all at once, because there is the sense of the kairotic moment, like the moment of stillness in your mind against the backdrop of all the busyness, this moment in every day. And Satan can't find this moment again, because the satanic is this contracted, narrowed, already cut off mentality, worldview. So Satan and his watch fiends can't find it. But what's so interesting then is Blake says the industrious find this moment. There's always an activity in Blake, the productions of time again. And when the industrious find this moment, they're able to multiply it. And when it once is found, it renovates. And again, the word is renovate. It renovates every moment of the day, if rightly placed. So we're very much called to participate in the realization of this moment, so that the moment could be known in every moment of the day, if rightly placed, of course, meaning in terms of our imaginative perception. If it is the guiding principle or the lodestar, or um, the philosopher's stone that catalyzes everything, then um, we know the divine moment in each moment and know it as the heart or the source or the truth of every moment, even in the multiplicity. So I love this visionary sense of activity, and it's calling the best in you, even as it's calling for the best in you to be let go of into the divine once more. And again, I think that sort of fits the modern mind rather well, and in a way, is even a bit of a relief, because the impulse that's already at work within you in terms of wanting to live well, speak well, love well, work well, enjoy the pleasures of life well. That doesn't have to be denied. It just has to be understood. And so our desire becomes our ally when rightly understood, rather than something that somehow needs to be quelled or removed or judged.
This reminds me again of another quote of Blake I have written down, and I realized that one should be very careful with how he interprets Blake, because Blake throws out these statements that can be very provocative, and understood the wrong way. I mean, once you consider his life and work, it becomes clear that the obvious meaning of the provocative meaning of the quote is not necessarily the correct interpretation. But at one point, in any case, he writes, "Those who control their passions do so because their passions are weak enough to be controlled." Um, so this is a very Nietzschean statement. But what do you think Blake is talking about here? Because, um, uh, I mean, from his life and his work, we can see that he's not encouraging a sort of hedonic embrace of every desire, but still he is celebrating our impulses and desires as, I suppose, creative and divine in origin. So what is he saying in this statement?
Yeah, I mean, of course, Blake lives before Nietzsche, so you're not saying, just to be clear
Yeah,
about that. And I think it's
yeah.
not a Nietzschean comment, although it can sound as if it is, because for Nietzsche, the passion is all we've got, if you like. Whereas what Blake is saying is, no, our passion is our desire for God. Um, but Blake phrases it like this because, well, for example, in another passage, he talks about how um, consumerism, which was being born in his time, um, the idea that we live well by having many possessions, Blake says that is not wrong, but it is mistaken. Because what he argues is that what's been substituted is many things for the all, as he puts it, for the more, for the divine. And the modern mind has re educated its desire to thinking that accumulation leads to satisfaction rather than understanding that the many things that we might accumulate are actually as many reflections of what we are too already part of, which is life in the all, in God, part of the divine body. Um, and so desire, properly understood, awakens you to that truth. But it can easily get, certainly in the modern world, in the cash economy, and where the means of production are all geared around the accumulation of things, it can easily get mistaken and misunderstood. But Blake captures, as he says, more is the cry of a mistaken soul. And then Blake adds, nothing less than all can satisfy man. And the all there is a reference to the divine all. It's in the same little pamphlet, Blake says that, where he summarizes, therefore God becomes as we are, that we may be as he is. Um, yeah, so passion is basically good, but it's often mistaken. And particularly in a context like the modern world where passions, before we've even thought about it really, are being trained to accumulate. But more is the cry of a mistaken soul. It's not exactly wrong. Mistaken is a bit more of a nuance there, um, because the desire, the passion, ultimately is a love for God, and Blake never loses sight of that.
The path is not to, I suppose, wage war on our impulses, to suppress them or to let them loose, but to understand them. And this reminds me, of course, of Blake's famous songs of innocence and songs of experience, which you discuss in the book and you analyze them as, I suppose, a picture of human development from a state of innocence into a state of experience and then beyond to a more mature, I suppose, form of innocence and experience. So, could you talk a bit about what Blake means by innocence and experience, and in how does he see this curve of personal development? I suppose.
Yeah, it's in a way it's more like a U shape, I think, because it's often to the child or the baby that we look to for innocence. But that is a sort of innocence which, as Blake would put it, dwells with ignorance, whereas what he really wants is an innocence that dwells with wisdom, as he puts it. So, if we're born with a kind of innocence that's also ignorance, and then we descend through experience down the YouTube of experience, but then from the other side can emerge a form of innocence that dwells with wisdom. And then you see that innocence is not naivety, but it's a capacity to say yes. That's how I think of it. Even given the experience that you might now know, which could be dark and difficult, even threatening and destructive, can you keep saying yes to life? It's a bit like, can you keep saying yes to desire, even though it often leads you astray? Um, and so this innocence is a really fundamental virtue for Blake, much like desire is a fundamental impulse. Because if you lose innocence, then you get trapped in the world of experience rather than the world of experience being a kind of contrary to innocence, but a contrary that amplifies the importance and the power of innocence. It's a bit like light and darkness. The darkness can threaten to swallow the light, but even the vaguest flicker of light can quell the darkness. Or love and hate, they're not opposites really. They're a love that's open and a hate that's contracted. And similarly with innocence and experience, even when Blake is describing actually youthful infant innocence, there's already a sense of experience there. The infant looks lovely in 1 minute and then screams in the next. It's a kind of ignorant screaming, which is why it needs parental protection. Um, but in a way, innocence never dwells in a naive, well, it can be naive, I suppose, but never dwells without experience. And hence, Blake, he does publish, first of all, a collection of poems called Songs of Innocence, but then a few years later publishes them again with Songs of Innocence and Experience. And the contraries of the human soul is how he describes these things. Um, but it's a question of whether you can have that innocence that's not a sort of denial, that'd be a more psychotherapeutic way of putting it, a withdrawal, but an innocence that is an affirmation and a welcoming of life, in spite of what may happen and what does happen.
I vaguely remember statement from the Gospels. I think it could have been Christ who encourages his disciples to be as innocent as doves and as wise as serpents. Do you think that this relates to what Blake is talking about? Considering the end of that U-shape development, where you get innocence and experience dwelling together.
Yeah, no, that completely makes sense. Um, and similarly, Christ will say, "Suffer the little children, come unto me." He's not suggesting we all infantilize ourselves, but as adults in the presence of children, you can help foster the flourishing of wise innocence within you. Um, and yeah, so they're the contrary states, the innocent dove and the wise serpent. Um, we need them both. And, you often get in spiritual teachings, and certainly in the teachings of Jesus, seemingly contradictory remarks. So Jesus in one moment will say, I've come to bring peace, but then in another moment he'll say, I haven't come to bring peace, I've come to bring a sword.
Mm.
Or in one moment, Christ will say, those who are not against us. So I'm having to remember this correctly. He talks about those who are against him really are against him, but then another moment he'll say, those who are not against us are for us. I haven't remembered that quite rightly, but the point is the sort of, it can seem like contradictory statements, and but when you understand it in this sort of field sense, that seeming contradictions are actually holding a whole domain of possibility within which the divine can be known and arises, like innocence and wisdom and so on. They actually come together, And yeah, so I think that the image of the dove and the serpent, and the children and the adult, that's doing exactly the same thing.
One thing that emerges not only in this conversation we're having, but I think in your book and generally upon taking a closer look at Blake, is that talking about innocence and experience and talking about imagination, and his constant encouragement to I suppose cleanse the doors of our perception, and his insistence to awaken our senses or that which perceives through the senses. um, Again and again it makes me think that William Blake is, not just a poet, not just an artist, even though he's an amazing poet and an amazing artist, but he just seems to share many qualities with a spiritual teacher, and the way that he expresses himself remind me very much of Eastern texts that deal with awakening, with enlightenment, and with moving towards a wider and radically different mode of perceiving and participating in reality. And I mean, I see that you've named your book not just, William Blake, the life and work of a great artist or poet. You've named it Awake with an exclamation mark. William Blake and the Power of the Imagination. So, could you talk a bit about, well, why you've chosen to name it Awake and that element in Blake which encourages us to change the way we see and experience the world?
Yeah, well, perception is the fundamental issue in Blake. As a man is, so he sees. And awake is a very Blakean word. God cries to Albion, "Awake, Albion," um, many times. And so that verb, which is common in Enlightenment spiritual traditions as opposed to Enlightenment rational traditions, um, it is a very natural one for Blake. And I wanted a sense in the title of my book that I'm talking about a Blake who can make a difference now. Um, and I think I'm just following what Blake himself said in that. This is not a book about how people have responded to Blake or about the significance of Blake in terms of the romantic movement or um, that kind of approach. What he says, "I give you the end of a golden string, only wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, built in Jerusalem's wall." So Jerusalem is the city that surrounds us, if you like, and in the city that surrounds us are these gateways to heaven. And if we just wind the golden string that Blake gives us into a ball, which of course is to follow where it's leading, then we'll come to heaven's gate built in Jerusalem's wall. He says, "I labor day and night to bring eternal worlds to people." So that you hear the voice of a spiritual teacher in Blake is because you've understood Blake correctly, put it like that. And when that aspect of Blake gets played down, I think that a bit like the narrowed imagination of the modern world, it can produce many interesting things, even powerful things, but it's missed something at the heart of all things.
And I think a conversation on Blake is never complete without mentioning the fact that he did have a very unusual um, experience of reality based on his report of visions, um, uh, not only in dreams, but visions that he had while awake and conversations with spiritual entities, the vision of a ghost, and so on. You take a very interesting approach in which I suppose you can talk a bit more about it, but I was it was very interesting for me to read how you don't just naively embrace this, of course, but you also don't try to analyze them or reduce them down to something which, can fit our current paradigm of the natural and the scientific. So could you talk a bit about how you've come to understand these visions that accompanied Blake throughout his life?
Yeah, I wanted to stay open to the reality of what Blake describes, but as you say, not naively, but to try and not just understand, but follow Blake into that. I think of it as a kind of in between space. Um, and so to encounter not just, as it were, products of the imagination, but the spiritual realities and beings and vitality that is part of the imagination that we live in as well. And so, for example, I one of the things which I try to avoid doing in the book is reading Blake through subsequent psychology, because it's very common to turn to some Carl Jung, for example, to understand Blake. But I think what's happening in Jung is it's helpful because it's saying inner life has a vitality, a presence, a structure, a form even of its own, which Jung talks about in terms of archetypes and so on. But the trouble is that when that's combined with the secular mentality now, it can become a sort of world, another world unto itself, another closed system. Um, Whereas I think what Blake is encountering is a living ecology that's quite as open as the natural world is, with novelty and surprise and encounter, autonomy of its own, um, all that kind of dynamism. And I think we really need that to be properly ontologically rooted in reality. Otherwise, we just substitute one model for another, a kind of psychological model for a materialist model, and we end up drawing more on abstractions than on living things. I mean, sometimes, for example, people talk about Blake in relation to what's sometimes called the imaginal. And the imaginal is a phrase, a word that was coined by a scholar of Sufism, Henri Corbin, to describe the kind of parallel world that is not hard and fast material, like the tangible world around us, but neither is it completely, well, intellectual in the sense of sort of pure ideas. Um, the imagine is somewhere in between. But I think that that already reifies an intermediary. And so I prefer to think of um, Blake saying, no, again, the breath works as an analogy for me. There isn't the world of breath that I relate to. The breath is part of me. And I give back, as it were, when I expire.
And after all the time you've spent studying Blake, his different works, and his life, if you could sum it up, in what way practically does he guide us to open up to that world of the imagination and not get caught up in the dark satanic mills? What does Blake teach? What is the practice, I suppose, or the attitude that cleanses the doors of perception?
Yeah, it's things like not saying I have imagination or you have imagination, but together we collaborate with the imagination that already flows around us. Um, it's talking about being called by the divine life, not just God being a sort of psychological entity within us, an aspect of ourselves, or in a more closed system kind of way. Um, more practically, it's about trusting, but also discerning your own desires, your own impulses, that which leads to the expansion of your soul. I mean, I quite naturally sort of sit up a bit and breathe in there. And what the Jesuits would call discerning the spirits, knowing, being able to follow the golden string means to um, lean into that which is expansive of your life and to become more aware of that which is constricting of your life. And so developing the habits and the virtues that enable that expansion. And that can be a difficult expansion as well. There can be things that happen in life that are very hard, but you know that by embracing them, you will grow. So this is the kind of wise innocence, the capacity to say yes. So it's an attitude towards life that reading Blake and others, of course, but reading Blake particularly can help foster, that then you can take into every moment of the day, um, and find Um, Therefore, that we, well, it's not just the it's a renovation in a way, as Blake puts it, because it's always alive anyway. But it's just that we've forgotten how to collaborate with it to the extent that we might.
Do you think that what you've just said comes with an overall idea of reducing the um, trust that we have in different systems and narratives that are thrown at us from society and others around us, and trying to orient ourselves more towards our inner subjective experience of the world, and then seeing what truth is revealed through that instead of the way that we're taught to talk about reality and to think about it.
Yeah, I think I mean, inner subjectivity, when it's understood as what I feel is my interiority, is actually just part of the inside of the whole world. That would be why it's not just a psychological move. I think the
Mm.
psychological move can help, but it's only really a first step to awakening to the inside of all other things. And of course, that then comes by sort of forgetting yourself actually and identifying with that which previously you would have said was outside of you.
This is an interesting distinction, that it's not just trying to live inside your own psyche, but opening up and seeing that this is the place where the world is experiencing itself, which again takes us to a very non-dual sort of
Yeah. I mean,
statement.
that's a useful other reference point because there can be what Coleridge, a near contemporary of Blake, called distinction without difference. So in one moment I might think of my interiority, but that's only a distinction without a difference to the interiority of the whole world. But I momentarily attend to my interiority in order that I can become more conversant with the interiority of all things. But that's very different from saying I must cut myself off, or
Yeah.
everything is just my psyche projected out onto the world. And similarly, I think that the energy of it comes from a kind of separation. Like modernity is all bad, the dark satanic mills are all bad, and therefore, we must lament the modern world. Half hope for a kind of collapse, and then we'll be reborn. That too is very un-Blakean, and it's a dualism in the most sort of strongest sense. Um, Whereas to understand what's yearning and struggling to be born in the modern world, where is the desire? How is that playing out? Where is it mistaken, but the energy of the desire is still true? Um, that's a much more, I think, non-dual and Blakean approach.
Thank you, Mark. We have gone over an hour, and this has been a beautiful conversation. And I've always been fascinated by Blake as an artist first, and then I've only recently discovered more about his poetry thanks to you. But your book has opened up an entire new world to me. I never really understood that Blake, no, other than an artist, is also not only a visionary but a mystic as well, and very much. I mean, I remain convinced that he can be read as a spiritual teacher. Um, so
Yeah, I
for
think. I mean, I think
viewers
that's right. I think you're hearing him correctly when you perceive that. Yeah.
for those who would like to learn more about Blake, your book, and in general, more of the things that you talk about, because this is not the first book you've written, and you have a podcast as well, an active Substack publication. Where would you direct people who would like to get more interesting nuggets of wisdom from you?
Thank you. Well, I have a website, markvernon.com, and I try to put everything there. But yeah, YouTube, Substack, there's a podcast. I hope these things will show up if you Google my name anyway, and Blake, or I've written books on Dante, about Christianity, particularly the mystical tradition, and other things too. So I hope it'd be relatively easy to find through search engines, but otherwise, markvernon.com is a place to go.
For me, I would just like to say that I've greatly enjoyed your Substack posts as well as your talks, and of course your new book, which I read in preparation for this conversation. So I highly recommend it to anyone interested. Thank
Hey, look,
you
well,
very
thank
much.
you for your time as well, Simon, because it's by teasing these things out and talking that we become aware of the living quality of these things. So I appreciate your time as well.
Thank you, and I appreciate yours. And it's been a pleasure, and would love to see you again on the podcast in the future. There's so many things to talk about.
Great. Well, look, I look forward to that.